Hello and welcome to the fifth week of the policy process course. We are switching books, moving from the section on evidence into a section about institution and polarization. And we'll be talking about the book Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop by Lee Drutman. As before, I'm not summarizing the book. I'm instead adding to it from other books about similar topics and calling out key points and things that might not be in the book directly. Okay, so Drutman has a pretty clean thesis here. And one of the things to be clear about is that a lot of calls for third parties or breaking party doom loops are against partisan democracy in general. This is not that. Drutman very much believes and says political parties are the central institutions of democracy. They clarify and structure alternatives, they make politics accessible to the masses, and they channel and organize political ambition. The only form of modern mass democracy that has worked is party democracy. We need strong, healthy parties for democracy to work well. We just need more than two. So, I just want to be very clear, what Drutman is calling for here is very different than let's run a third party for president. The Democrats and Republicans are both awful, etc., etc. He is saying specifically that we need different underlying structures that enable third parties to exist. And also that we should not be actively party bashing, or our ultimate goal should not be some sort of no labels vision, say, of having no parties or no labels. The reason people use labels is to clarify and organize the world, right? And this is true for politics as it is for sorting out your cupboard with a label maker, or organizing things into categories in your closet or your room, or your life, your notes, etc. We legitimately need political parties in the same way that we need to organize the rest of our lives, and parties are the mechanism by which we organize within politics. Okay, so let's start with understanding what he means by a doom loop. And this is just doom loops are reinforcing cycles that are really hard to break. So being in debt is one example. You're in debt, and then it turns out it's expensive to be poor, in the sense of buying things you can no longer buy in bulk and to get discounts, but you also are charged for being in debt. Once you're in credit card debt, interest piles up, you go into more debt, student loan debt, etc. All of these forms of debt can in fact wind up trapping you in a cycle of getting more debt. Partisanship forms this doom loop because as one party polarizes, the other party has incentive to polarize. Particularly with our current structure in the primaries, where getting elected involves appealing only to the subset of your party that turns out in primaries, which is a very small subset that tends to be further from the center. Now, I will say one thing I want to say is I'm talking about partisanship in general. I don't want to confuse this with some sort of generic being in the center is good. There's nothing to specifically say that centrist policy positions are the right policy position. However, I am suggesting that having non-representative electorates leads to a cycle of polarization. And we'll also talk about the degree to which polarization could potentially be healthy and the right amount. The other thing I want to talk about with chapter 1 is learning from history. So the founders did not agree with each other. So I'll be upfront, one of my pet peeves is whenever anyone says the founders thought X or Y or Z or whatever. You can say that certain documents said things or that certain founders wrote certain things, but there's no cohesive group called the founders that had a unified point of view about how politics and political institutions should work in the United States. They were constantly arguing with each other. What we got as a result of that argument, I think they generally did a very good job with the information available to them at the time. I'm not saying any of this to rag on the founders or show any form of disrespect. The institutions they produced have worked fairly well for a fairly long time, better than one might expect. But we also shouldn't say, okay, we can never update these institutions using any of the information we've learned since then, right? Or obviously there's an amendment process for a reason. And the founders, though, also generally were very skeptical of political parties, right? And that's a place where a lot of modern political science sort of disagrees and suggests that parties are actually necessary intermediaries, and that's why they sort of arise naturally within all democracies, and we should probably set up institutions that are designed to handle that, to handle our need for intermediaries to translate like public opinion and public thoughts and values and so forth into concrete and specific policies. Okay, partisan sorting. So in 1950, the American Political Science Association actually released a plea for more partisanship, arguing that the parties were so similar that the public couldn't differentiate between them intelligently. Apart from, the be careful what you wish for example that is pretty obvious here, there is something to the idea that like parties are supposed to take distinct stances, right? So to the extent that like their policies are polarized, this is potentially not a problem. Like if two parties have very distinct policies and they're still able to negotiate and act, and the people in those parties don't dislike each other strongly and like view each other as literal threats to the well-being of the republic, well, then that's fine, right? Like our issue is, I mean, fine might be a strong word, but like our issue is not that parties have distinct policy positions that people can vote for. And it's not even like where those policy positions are, left or right. Part of the issue is the animosity here, and part of what causes that is that in some ways the easiest way for the out party to win is just to block the in party. Particularly with credit going to the presidency, in the case of divided government, one of the easiest ways to restore your party to power is to straight up obstruct the function of government so that there are no wins for the president to run on, etc. And then, of course, like politics and policy is hard. Building your own agenda is hard. Negative ads are extremely effective and, generally much easier to point out what is flawed than figure out how to entirely fix it. And thus, negative ads work because, again, there's only two parties, right? So, like, taking down the other party clearly builds you up. In an environment with, like, 5 parties, you could simultaneously run negative ads against the other 4 parties, right? But this is probably much less effective than attempting to build up the affirmative case for your own party. So this is the unhelpful balance that we're talking about. On parties, Ezra Klein is a journalist, wrote for the Washington Post and Vox, and he's coming up here because he wrote a book called Why We're Polarized, which I think is an excellent book on a similar topic. Klein's book is a bit more focused on like the individual psychology of polarization, and it's written as a journalist, so it's pretty accessible and readable. I like Drutman's book because it's a bit more institutionally based. Klein also basically ends the book by saying, this is what's happening, I have no idea what to do about it, which it provides its own value, but I do like that Drutman also gives us some suggestions to discuss about like how could we actually change some of our institutions to avoid these outcomes. I sort of already talked about this last bullet, but negative partisanship really plays this key role because when there are 2 parties, it's easy to advance the standing of your own by decreasing the standing of the other. Okay, so little quiz game. Which president said each thing? First quote, I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here even though some time back they may have entered illegally. Second quote, the era of big government is over. Give you some time to guess which president, or at least which party. Okay, first one, Republican Ronald Reagan. Second one, Democrat Bill Clinton. So we do see, this is now 30, 40 years ago, back in the 80s and 90s, but we did have this sort of overlap in the parties on at least some issues, and it was much easier to see that it was not as plainly predictable which party would take which stance at any given time. Okay, we need to understand what happened in the great reordering of the parties. So Drutman basically contends that there were 4 parties. You have the Dixiecrats, and they play a really central role in this story. Southern Democrat Party, we'll call them Dixiecrats so that we don't have to keep saying Southern Democratic Party, from the 1890s to 1970s was really its own institution, and it formed an alliance with the National Democratic Party. So they were both Democrats, but they were in essence separate on their views and policies, although they did have some overlap allowing the alliance. Dixiecrats provided the votes for National Democratic control, and Democrats in exchange essentially made a deal saying, we will let you enforce segregation and one-party rule in the South. Dixiecrats during this time controlled like 95% of elected offices in the South. So I do mean one-party rule. And then Republicans were also split North and South. This is less a key part of our story, but we did have Northern Republicans who tended to be liberal and Southern Republicans who were more conservative. So essentially you have the two parties we know today, but split North and South. 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Goldwater campaign marked a turning point. So Civil Rights Act was passed by a Democratic president, but it also was actually supported by a number of Republicans in Congress. However, the Republican nominee in 64 was Barry Goldwater, ran against the Civil Rights Act. That, combined with having a Democratic president who signed it into law, supported it, pushed it through Congress, meant that the party started to polarize around civil rights, with Democrats being the pro-Civil Rights Party and Republicans being against the Civil Rights Movement and Civil Rights Act. Over the next 50 years, then the parties start sorting on ideology. So Southern conservatives, who used to be Democrats or Dixiecrats, become Republicans. Northern liberals, who used to be Republicans, become Democrats. Kentucky is, in some sense, still doing some of this sorting. Kentucky has far more registered Democrats than you would expect for how Republican it is in terms of voting. And you could also see the divide in Kentucky as well as West Virginia, in that they're still more likely to have a lot of state-level Democrats. Not a lot anymore. But go back a few years, and you still see some remnants of this with Andy Beshear and Joe Manchin, where despite the fact that at a national level, both Kentucky and West Virginia are very Republican states, they still had very strong Democratic parties coming out of this, and they sorted a bit more slowly than states that were further south. Anyway, apart from the specifics of Kentucky, we also saw this sort of sorting on pretty much everything else. So race, religion, geography, you can predict now voter preferences very well by knowing the population density of the area in which the voter lives. So urban being more Democratic, rural being more Republican. And this overlapping sorting leads to these information bubbles that wouldn't exist with sorting only on each individual level. And we talked about information bubbles with our last book in terms of like the flow of information and individually. But hopefully this puts together the idea that like these also exist for institutional reasons and long-running historical patterns that led to this. And also, in case we didn't emphasize it enough last time, like information bubbles are not solely online or modern. They're also like who you talk to, who you work with, who your kids go to school with. All of those things are actually much stronger than the online information bubbles in terms of when we talk about where people get information. They're more ideologically sorted in their workplaces and neighborhoods than they are in their online news consumption. And we won't get into this as much, but there probably are some psychological underpinnings to this sorting as well. The final thing I want to talk about a little bit, there's a lot more in the book, but something I want to touch on is the role of identity politics. And this is covered a lot more in some books that I've assigned in the past but didn't assign today. I talked about like Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein. There's also Democracy for Realists, which is a very political science heavy book by a couple of academics. And they get into this idea that like politics is driven by group identities. Like we can say there's this rise of identity politics, but politics has always been to some extent a means of expressing how we belong to different groups and where we divide. Like most people outside of classes like this one do not have strong opinions about individual policies. They have values that they seek to transmit into policies. They have people they like. They have groups they want to see. They have notions of fairness and all of that. But they're generally not policy nerds, which, good for them. Even as a policy nerd, like frequently the thing I want to do is, watch a TV show or some sports or hang out with my friends socially and not talk about politics, right? So I am not in any way critiquing or suggesting that like people should be into politics all the time. There's a limit to how useful it even is. But I do want to remind you all that like you're taking a class like this voluntarily. This is, selection bias in the sense of like I've seen proposals for what if we did budgeting by having a group of citizens get in the room and talk to each other about the budget for their cities. And while this has some merit, I want to point out that there's very few things that these citizens would, you know, rather avoid than a policy seminar, right? Like most people do not want to be in a 3.5 hour seminar over politics and policy. But the issue we have with group identity that's more unique to the modern era is like the crisis emerges when partisan identities fall into alignment with other social identities. So it used to be that you could be, in a different party, but still in a union with somebody, or still at the same church building, or still in the same social clubs, or your kids went to the same school, or you lived in the same neighborhood, or you at least watched the same news from one of the like 3 national news networks, right? None of that is true anymore. So now we have like these overlapping patterns that divide people. All of this leads to motivated reasoning, which, again, we talked about some in the book in our last section. So like we're more likely to remember evidence that agrees with what we want to be true while dismissing stuff that does not agree. And an additional source of conflict and confusion that is pointed out is that each party has some of what the other wants in sort of fascinating ways. Like the right really does have substantial political power, and yet when you look at a lot of what the right seems to want and request, it's a lot of cultural and economic power. Like many of the things that politicians are talking about are not per se policies. Like some of them have overlapping policies that they would like, but a lot of the concerns are about like where the country is moving culturally and economically. And the left has a lot of cultural and economic power, like for reasons we won't explore now, but that are probably interesting in their own right. There are a lot more like artists and writers and so forth who have a leftward political view. The areas of the country that are more likely to vote for Democrats are much stronger economically right now. Again, getting back to like just that urban-rural divide, we're seeing stronger GDP growth in urban areas as one very simple indicator of economic power. And I mean, it's oversimplified a bit, but like this notion of the divide between political power and cultural and economic power and who has what and who wants what it was to me an interesting way of sort of framing some of the additional conflict here. Okay, that's all I had to say on the first 4 chapters. These are the discussion questions that I'll post in Slack, and look forward to talking about this with all of you.